Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to welcome you to our session, The Art of Sharing, the Richer versus the Poorer Provinces Since Confederation, presented by the Harris Center in partnership with the Department of Political Science here at Memorial University. And we're happy to see some faculty and students from the department in attendance here today. I'm Rob Greenwood, Director of the Harris Center and AVP Public Engagement and External Relations for Memorial University. And delighted today, we're joined by Dr. Mary Janigan, well-known historian and former policy journalist, whose book, also titled The Art of Sharing, the Richer versus the Poorer Provinces Since Confederation, examines Canada's system of transfer payments and the history of equalization in Canada. In her book, Dr. Janigan goes back to Confederation to trace the escalating tensions among the provinces across decades, a tension we are very familiar with here in Newfoundland and Labrador to this day. A few housekeeping items first. Today's session is being recorded as we are live streaming via Zoom and YouTube. You will be able to watch the recording of this session as soon as live stream ends. You can share with your friends. We will be taking questions after Dr. Janigan presents, and we invite everyone at home to type their questions into the Q&A, and we will read them out when the time comes. You can also ask questions aloud if you'd like. Just let us know in the chat or raise your hand and we'll unmute you. We also have some free books, compliments of our presenter, that we will give away at the end of today's session. If you'd like an opportunity to receive one of those books, all you have to do is ask a question during the session, and that can be online or one of the live ones, and your name will be entered into the draw. And we'll notify the winners by email after the event. First, though, I'd like to give the land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands and those where you are located today, and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. Now, let's welcome our guest. Dr. Mary Janigan is a former journalist who obtained a doctorate in Canadian history from York University in 2017. We didn't discuss this, Mary, but I also did my master's at York University in history. Great history department.
Yes.
Her first history book, Let the Eastern Bastards Freeze in the Dark, The West versus the Rest Since Confederation, was published in 2012 and won the J.D. Defoe Book Prize in 2013. Dr. Janigan completed an MA in history at York in 2008-9, and prior to that was a journalist for more than 3 decades, including a decade on Parliament Hill. Dr. Janigan holds a decades-long fascination with resource control, as well as equalization and transfer payments, which she emphasizes are not boring. And if you're on here today, I suspect you agree with us. And she intends to keep on writing history books for the rest of her days. Welcome, Mary. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to you, Mary, to do your presentation, and then we'll open it up to our audience for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rob, and the Harris Center and Memorial. I'm honored to be here, simply honored, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the ancestral traditional territories of many diverse Indigenous peoples, especially land covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Thank you for having me. I wrote the book. I have been mesmerized by fiscal federalism for decades. When I was a journalist on Parliament Hill and after, I began to notice that the real negotiations, the real discussions were happening around where the money went, who paid what, for whom. And they were making these deals in back rooms, and I determined to understand where that money was going, what were the conditions, how it worked. So I went back in time. I went back to Confederation when they were negotiating the provinces and they were discussing who would get what share of the monies raised. One of the things that was fascinating was officially every province was supposed to be equal. They had to be equal or else. But behind the scenes, it was fierce. Ottawa, the federal government, would give subsidy payments, 3 different types, to the provinces, if in turn it got the right to raise customs duties. And the maritime provinces were totally dependent on these duties, these revenues. So they knew they were losing a big revenue source. So they fought behind the scenes for more money. First, New Brunswick, with Confederation, got a subsidy increase totally unrelated to the cost of government, even though that's what it was supposedly for. 2 years later, after Joseph Howe fought and finally gave up, Ottawa granted to Nova Scotia special terms that lasted for 10 years in one way, and they got another subsidy for another debt allowance. So you have right from the start unacknowledged inequities, but they can't be called that. No one's saying this is going to be permanent. Everyone is saying, okay, we're going to go along. Well, it turned out the provinces made a terrible bargain, because Ottawa's revenues kept going up, but the subsidies were spelled out in terms of population in the Constitution. So first, in 1887, the provinces got together and tried to get more money. Sir John A. ignored them. Then you look at the provinces skittering into the 20th century, struggling to perform what a state does now. Before it, they had very basic duties. Suddenly, you've got Canada industrializing, manufacturing bases growing. You realize that what has to happen is they have to find more money. They need to back the bonds for canals and railroad companies. They're struggling to build the apparatus of a modern state, put in regulations, oversee measurements, 10, 20, 30 things they never had to do, at least not in that way before. So they go back in 1907 and they get an increase from Sir Wilfrid Laurier. They actually have to amend the Constitution to get this increase. But they once again put in a number for the subsidies that was linked to population, and that this was supposed to be the special deal to end all. They get through World War I somehow, all the governments. 1918, the provinces go back and ask for more money. It doesn't work. They are all fighting with each other, and the wealthier ones don't want more money to go to the poorer ones. Plus, you have a complication. From the moment Ottawa created the 3 prairie provinces, it had ensured that it retained resource control. So it had control of waters, forests, oil and gas, every resource, whereas the other provinces owned the resources and kept the revenue. This added to the confusion and the chaos. By 1927, the Maritimes, Newfoundland has not joined Confederation till 1949, as you know. The Maritimes are in an uproar. They feel they're falling behind economically. 3 prairie provinces have reached the stage where behind the scenes there's talk of them seceding. So by 1927, Mackenzie King returns control of the resources to the three prairie provinces, and he increases the subsidies for the Maritimes. If you notice, these are special increases that came as the result of a royal commission. So they are out of step, but no province is saying inequality is a permanent condition of the Federation. And no province would even dream of asking for a remedy. Get into the 1930s, and now we have huge problems. Many Canadians move from their towns to cities, and they cannot manage to support themselves without help from churches and their families. But those are no longer available, at least on the scale that's needed. Some charities are getting supported by governments, but it's really getting to the point where people are suffering. There's no talk of more social programs except old age pensions, which came in 1927. You have talk of unemployment insurance, but that's going nowhere. Alberta finally is about to declare insolvency. It does. It defaults on its bonds. The Maritime provinces have two royal commissions to look at them, and they get another subsidy increase, but they say it's not enough. Mackenzie King knows Saskatchewan and Manitoba are about to default. So he helps the provinces, those two anyway, with loans and with increased relief payments, but he also appoints the Royal Commission to look at where revenues and responsibilities are going. That Royal Commission on Dominion Provincial Relations, unfortunately, reported in 1940. Right at that point, the Nazis were about to go through France. This was a non-starter. The Royal Commission recommended special payments for the provinces called national adjustment grants, which would go to help those provinces that needed help with their spending on key programs. That Royal Commission also paid very close attention to Australia. It's surprising how many links there were between Australia and Canada. In 1933, Australia had federated in 1901. The province of Western Australia voted to secede. This terrified the central government. It came up with something called the Commonwealth Grants Commission, which, through a very quirky formula, covered spending and revenue collection. In other words, tried to adjust, gave grants to adjust for provinces that were poorer through looking at how much they could raise through taxes and what they were spending. So we had two formulas there, but no chance of the provinces agreeing to adopt what the Royal Commission recommended in 1940. It was wartime. Three provinces, Mackenzie King wouldn't dream of doing it. It was centralizing for Ottawa. But he let three provinces object, and they took the blame. And instead, Ottawa took control of three key revenues in each province. This was called tax rentals, and it pocketed the agreement and returned some of the money and a grant, depending on the situation of the provinces. We get out of the war, and Ottawa wants to keep this going, keep the money. It's becoming convinced that Keynes was right. It knows that it needs more money for defense. So it's struggling to keep this money under its control. Ontario balks initially and then goes on along. Quebec will not. It says that its revenues and its responsibilities are its responsibility. So it starts losing money through the tax rental deals first 5-year deal ends in 1952. Saint Laurent is prime minister now. Quebec is really losing funds. Duplessis doesn't know what to do, the Quebec premier. He puts on an income tax, which would have meant personal income tax, which would have meant that Quebec taxpayers were being double taxed. Saint Laurent does something so uncharacteristic after that. He goes out and he claims that Quebec is a province like the others. This leads to a huge quarrel with Quebec. Saint Laurent knows he has to fix this. He came up with equalization. He gets an awful lot of the credit. He was the Francophone counsel on the Royal Commission. He knew what had been proposed. He knew about the other models. So he took these tax rental deals and he took out the grant portion, the portion that compensated, and he made it available to every province. So no province was truly happy. He announced at a 1955 conference that this was what he was going to do. It was unilateral, although he did listen to Ontario object, and the maritime provinces especially object. But he went ahead. It was an ingenious solution because suddenly every province had barely enough money to be able to join in federal, provincial, social programs. So he brings in equalization in 1957. Many social groups, especially in the rest of Canada, had been pleading with Ottawa. They even started during the end of the war and after the war for the introduction of social programs. They argued that this was what had been promised, the good life, if everyone survived the war and got through it. So on the one hand, you had Quebec wanting to keep control of its revenues and responsibilities. And on the other hand, these social groups pushing for social programs. And the groups who were pushing, I went through so many documents. Only rarely did they realize the problem was the poorer provinces couldn't afford it. Suddenly, with equalization, you had the Canada Assistance Plan, which paid for welfare, social assistance. You had hospital care, which started around the same time, which paid for a set group of hospital procedures. You had post-secondary education support, which Ottawa introduced and different provinces cost shared. And then you got to Medicare. None of this would have been possible without equalization. Equalization helped. Now, Saint Laurent lost the election, partly because he did this. Ontario turned against Saint Laurent, arguing that it needed a bigger share of its personal income tax. The maritime provinces were furious because truly their situation had not improved all that much. John Diefenbaker came in and he gave Ontario more. He campaigned on this issue and he campaigned with the Ontario premier. And it's part of the reason he won. You can look at polls to see how the mood changed. So Diefenbaker gave Atlantic grants to the maritime to Atlantic Canada, and he adjusted Ontario's share of the income tax. Where does this leave us today? I could go over the formula after, but I think the message of my book is without equalization, we would not exist as a federation. Every other developed federation has some form of equalization, except the United States, which does these transfers by specific areas. So you'll get highway building grants, you'll get road building grants. You might get some education grants, but not much. And that means that the difference that wealthy and poorer American states spend on education per capita is massive. If you compare Mississippi with New York, it's pretty horrific. And I think it accounts for some of the gaps in American educational funding, what it puts into education. I think that the appreciation of equalization, which really is the program that is a gift from the generation that came home from World War II, I believe it needs to be fostered and continued. Now, Newfoundland is in a fascinating situation. Equalization, just very briefly, is based on fiscal average for each province, or for Canada, actually, what the provinces can collect from a set of taxes: personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, consumption taxes, I think it's property, one other, and then resources. And Newfoundland would qualify for equalization, except what it can raise from its set of taxes per capita is much more than Ontario, what Ontario is judged to be at for its fiscal share. So it doesn't get that. But of course, the Atlantic Accords are designed to compensate for that. Two other points, and I believe I should be done. Equalization is done on a per capita basis. So of course it looks like Quebec gets more. But actually, all the other three Atlantic Canada provinces and Manitoba get more per person than Quebec. And it's too bad that these unfortunate contrasts get thrown in there. And number two, when Jason Kenney, the former Alberta Premier, was campaigning against equalization, I listened to a lot of speeches in which he seemed to indicate that the Alberta government was sending equalization money to Ottawa. But of course, it's not. It's every federal taxpayer. And it's not just taxpayers in the poorer, but it's taxpayers in the richer provinces as well. And the reason everyone does this is because equalization brings both equity and efficiency. You do not want to have poorer educational and health systems in one province, causing people to move in search of better health care or better education to another. As well, it is a very good way to ensure that there is less friction in the Federation. Now, that doesn't mean that equalization is sacred. It's not. Equalization's formula was last reviewed in 2014, and then they automatically, the feds, because that's their right, they automatically renewed it in 2019. It's federal money, it's unconditional, nobody fills out an application form, and the Atlantic Accord money, which I notice is in the last budget is 88 million, is meant to compensate Newfoundland for any loss of equalization from resource revenue calculations. I think it's a wonderful program without a sacred formula. The program comes up for renewal in 2024. I'm sure that the finance ministers are having discussions with Ottawa behind the scenes. This is they cannot force change, but they can advise, and perhaps adjustments can be made. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Mary, and great to have a historical perspective on a national program that does have massive impact on our province. I know we have a bunch of colleagues and participants on this that may have questions or observations. And Kathy keeps track of people with the Q&A, but also in the chat. And as we've indicated, if someone wants to put up their hand or indicate on the chat that they would like to come on live, and we'll turn on the mic for them to ask their question, we're happy to do that. Kathy, anyone lined up there now?
Yeah, we've got Dave already put his hand up right away, and so I think it'd be great to give the floor to him for a minute or so.
Wonderful. And Dave, you need no introduction with us, but if you could, for Mary's sake, say a little bit about your background and then what point you'd like to raise.
Thanks, Rob.
Yes.
Oh, I think you're muted there, Dave. I don't know if Mandy or Kathy can fix that, or. Looks like you're unmuted.
I can't hear.
No, and there
there you are.
Okay,
Thank
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep, clear as a bell.
Okay, yeah, I'm a former clerk of the Executive Council, deputy minister within the provincial government, and interested in public policy, an associate of the Harris Centre, and had a long involvement with equalization over the years in from an academic standpoint. Mostly, I never served as deputy minister of finance, but I did work in the federal finance department some years ago, early in my career. The equalization program that we have in Canada is focused on the revenue side, not on the expenditure side.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem we have, because we're distributed over such a large territory. And I know that there are various options available in terms of inclusion of resources, inclusion of 50% of the resources. The formula is quite complex. I think another talk you gave made reference to the fact that at one point there were only two people in the Department of Finance who played tennis in Ottawa and who were very knowledgeable about, and I knew those guys actually. But anyway, and I never played tennis with them. But anyway, so it's a program that's focused on the revenue side and everything, and it's heavily influenced right now by our revenues, offshore oil and gas revenues. Now we have another program, as I understand it, which relates to the territories. So my question to you is, does the program, the equalization program that relates to the territories, does that take allowance for differences in the cost of providing public services in the territories? And would it be beneficial for a province like Newfoundland, which is currently not receiving any equalization payments, if we had the option of opting into the territorial equalization program?
I spoke with someone who worked with Saskatchewan and also worked on the territorial programs, Greg Marchildon. Yes, it does take far greater. First of all, I don't think it could be done, because then every province would want to do that. The territorial financing is a totally separate program, and it does take account of the massive expenses and the low revenues that the territories have. They basically are almost totally dependent on federal grants. It's an ingenious idea, and of course I have heard of you and your expertise, but I think it's a non-starter. There are other suggestions, however. that well could work. Number one, I look at there are two other major transfer programs, the Canada Health Transfer and the Canada Social Transfer. The health transfer is done on a per capita basis, as is the social transfer. But we saw from the failure of talks last week, which have not permanently failed. No one can afford to walk away from the offer of federal money with some conditions. I think it's going to come to the fact that they look at the per capita grants, which right now are equal for each province, and make some adjustments for provinces that have older populations. This is the way it's probably going to have to go. Newfoundland, in particular, has a rapidly aging population, aging more rapidly, I believe, than any other province. So Newfoundland should be getting more from the Canada Health Transfer. As for equalization, the formula is not sacred. I think there are ways to play with it. Trevor Toome, the Alberta economist, has suggested letting provinces go above the fiscal capacity cap. So perhaps Newfoundland could get a bit more per capita than what Ontario gets. This brings up the old problem of each province being angry and jealous of what the other gets. But there's room to play there. That economist also suggested that perhaps Newfoundland could find a way to raise a bit more revenue, although I think with Muskrat Falls and its electrical bills, that might be going a little far. But there are other ways to play with that calculation. One of the two people you spoke about who were experts, he wrote a fascinating paper about we really shouldn't try to get into provincial spending. And I have to say, I agree with him. Australia can do it, but it's difficult. And in Canada, federation with so many differences, provinces would resent Ottawa prying into their spending. And I could see this going nowhere but trouble. I would welcome an opposing view.
Dave, further thoughts on what Mary had to say, or
No, I think
directions you wanna go?
I think the answer is excellent. I appreciate the answer, because exactly where you took the answer was exactly where the problem is, which is healthcare expenditures, because our healthcare expenditures cannot be covered within the existing arrangements. That's the big problem right now, because our healthcare expenditures, for whatever reason, not easily explained, is so far out of whack with the rest of Canada that something needs to be done. And whether it's through equalization or whether it's through the health care program, it doesn't really matter how it's done as long as the problem is addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. High
Thanks a
praise.
million,
Thank you.
Dave. And I know Dave could delve much more into this, but Kathy, do we have other folks online with a question or comment?
Yeah, we've got another question there. And I think Mary, you've addressed some of this, but the question came in just before Dave started to talk. So I'll ask it anyway. And then there was a bit of a follow-up. So what comes next for equalization? Should it stay the same or evolve to something else in the context of renewal of the legislation and beyond? And then the follow-up to that is of course, the reaction to what you were talking about there, basic indeed, but with angry voices from the West, for example, what are the feds likely to do?
Thanks, Kathy. Mary, thoughts on that?
That's a very good question. I think, I'm sure they're playing with all the variables now. This has gone on too long. It'll be 10 years since they played with the formula. They cannot just renew it again. They have to take a better, longer look at what it's doing and how it's working. There is another program called stabilization, which helps provinces, whether or not they receive equalization, if their revenues dip abruptly. And Krista Freeland addressed that formula, that program 3 years ago. She tripled the amount that provinces could qualify for, and that did bring more money to Alberta. Not much, but some. Although then the debate got heated by the debate being skewed. In other words, that Alberta taxpayers were paying for this instead of all Canadian taxpayers. There are several things they could also play with. Right now, equalization grows by nominal GDP, which is roughly 0.8% of GDP. It's not a satisfactory way to run the formula. I do not know what else to suggest, but automatically growing is perhaps not the way to have it working. There are other things that they've played with, changing the number of provinces that are used for a standard. They could come up with anything. There are a lot of criticisms, by the way, to go somewhere else for a minute. One of the reasons that people cite Quebec for criticism and Manitoba is the argument that both provinces are not taking enough money, enough resource, enough revenue from their hydro companies. That is true, probably. But you have to think, what would happen if Ottawa started telling provinces what to do in order to calculate their equalization? I don't think Newfoundland would take it very well if they were told to raise their taxes to qualify for more equalization. And I cannot see the feds telling Quebec to take more money from Hydro-Quebec or Manitoba to take more from its hydro company. It becomes an economist's dream. I did. They've already made reference to the two people in Ottawa who putatively understood it. I spoke to that man, Doug, and he was amazing. And I asked him if it was true that Pierre Trudeau had once called him and asked him to explain equalization to the cabinet. And he said, yes, that's true. He said, I told him I could probably cancel my tennis game and I could be there. So I said, well, did they understand? And he said, no, I'm afraid they were no wiser no matter what I said. They didn't understand. And I think that's a bit of a disgrace. You know, it's the formula is calculated in relative secrecy, and the inputs are not always clear. And I think a bit of transparency would go a long way to assuaging many in other parts of Canada, and especially in Newfoundland. I saw how Chaz Crosby was running his, I saw that ad that he ran about equalization. It really, the Atlantic Accords compensate for the loss of equalization revenue due to natural resource revenues. It's just simply not clear to many. And many Newfoundlanders still don't have easy lives. They have to go to Fort McMurray. They have to move. That's another reason the population is aging. So many have left the province in order to look for better lives elsewhere. I'm terrifically glad that other oil and gas projects are coming on stream for Newfoundland. I'm not sure it'll save the province, and Muskrat Falls is quite unsettling. But I know the province is making every effort to help itself. I know it's got a committee set up, a commission set up to look what happens when Churchill Falls revenue comes back to Newfoundland. Everyone is trying. It's too bad it's 2041. And I hope that Equinor comes through. And
Well,
Gull Island.
I think we have a few of the committee members on our call today. Kathy, any other questions, comments lined up there?
Yeah, we've got a question there from Ellen. Is equalization likely to be a divisive issue that could potentially cause fractures in the Federation in the near future?
Well, it came pretty close with Alberta's referendum, but that went nowhere. Alberta asked its citizens if they would support removing the principle of equalization from the Constitution. And it campaigned with a very inflammatory ads and speeches. And that was one. But somehow we muddled through there. It's coming up for renewal in 2024. It could cause more trouble. I think, I hate to sound this way, but I believe it is the responsibility of politicians to ensure that they don't appeal to the worst instincts of Canadians. I mean, equalization is the moral act of sharing among the Federation members, but it's also a very pragmatic deal. If if people in poorer provinces started streaming to the wealthier provinces to get better care, there'd be a lot of problems. I believe it's an obligation on political leaders to not appeal to those worst instincts. And I do think that Jason Kenney, who was an estimable federal minister, rather disgraced himself by running against equalization, which was really running about a host of other Alberta problems, such as the transportation of oil and gas out of the province. There was a secret agenda there. So I hope it doesn't turn into something that could split Canada. I mean, Canada's come so close so often, and equalization has solved so much. Fingers crossed.
Thanks, Mary. Kathy, I don't know if I do have one in mind that I haven't run by Mary before, but I'd rather go to the audience. Do you have any other questions or comments there, Kathy?
We've got some space for you to ask a question there if you have one. There hasn't been another question that's come in, so this is a good opportunity to poke the audience again and say, get your questions in there if you have them. Oh, I do see that. Oh, Jim Fian just raised his hand, but then he also took it down. So, so Jim, if you would like to talk, then that would be great, I think.
Yep, I see Jim's
Okay.
hand up there. So, Jim, again,
Okay,
we
so
all
I'm
know
here.
you well. You can say who you are.
Oh, I know who he is.
Okay.
I read and cite your papers all the time.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, Mary, I just had a quick comment
Good.
about the hydro issues and the impact of properly accounting for hydro revenues on equalization. You had mentioned that, well, you know, if the Fed's adjusted for that, it would be tantamount to asking the provinces to raise their hydro rents or collection from hydro resources or any natural resources, I suppose. But it doesn't, I would disagree a little there because it does send them that signal, but you're not, the federal government doesn't obligate anyone. It's simply saying, well, you could have collected so much more. You're just giving the revenue to consumers through low rates.
It's true.
So that Quebec would not be, or Manitoba or any province wouldn't be told effectively to raise your rates. They're just saying, well, you've got fiscal capacity there you're not using. So we're not going to give you as much equalization payments because you do have this fiscal capacity. It's still their choice as to whether or not to change their hydro policies or any other tax policy. So they're not quite being told to change their policy.
Except, oh, pardon me. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead. That's
Trevor Toom has calculated what would happen. First of all, because it counts as resource revenue, it's based on actual revenues, sadly. But number two, I have somewhere Trevor Toom's calculation of what would happen if Quebec raised its rates. And it does have an effect on its equalization payments. So, I mean, there are reasons for people to be disconcerted with Quebec and Manitoba for this approach. I wish I could find the actual amounts. I sent it out to Dave and Kathy.
Yeah, actually, I calculated some amounts as well. So I know the numbers are large. It would be a fairly large portion of hydro.
It would be quite a large hit to their equalization payments.
On the other hand, it reflects the fact that they've got
I found this on the web.
I'm sorry?
It shows that hydro, that Quebec does have this massive fiscal capacity that's not being taken in.
Yes.
So I guess there's two
Yes.
ways. I think it's more the politics of it than
Of course.
economics of it.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and you know the history of the politics more than anybody, I think.
No, that's not true. And I have read your papers. They're so good. They've been a huge help to me over the years. Thank you.
Oh, I've learned a lot from your stuff too. So it's all very interesting.
So Jim,
you.
stay on there if you like, but maybe I'll add to this discussion, Mary, how, you cite in your book with the Jason Kenney when he was premier experience.
Yes.
And the discontent in the West. And we know that hasn't gone away. Is this an opening if that discontent festers more? And we know Saskatchewan is not much different. That some of what Jim is saying is a possible solution? Or do you think that would be more self-destructive to the Federation if it goes that direction?
Good question. I think that I believe that the healthcare discussions last week, I mean, it's one thing to talk about equalization, and I guess you can get everybody riled up with misunderstandings. But the healthcare discussion was far more important to placating the provinces. I mean, they will eventually raise the social transfer as well, I assume. But the healthcare is immediate. Anyone who's been in emergency in Ontario for the past few weeks can see that the healthcare system's not working. And it has become a focus that could really hurt the Federation. And the provinces are blaming Ottawa for their inability to ensure that they can make things work for their citizenry. So it is a blame game, but healthcare, Ottawa transferred years ago some tax points. It lowered its taxes and allowed the province to raise theirs. So it equalized some of those tax points. So it looked at what a province would raise if those tax points were equalized up to that level. Now, Ottawa is counting the tax points as part of what it contributes. And that's totally fair. It's a cash transfer in the tax points. But who remembers the tax point transfer? What does that mean? If you are looking for a joint replacement, if you're sitting in emergency, what Ottawa is arguing is it's not going to work. So the question about could Alberta and Saskatchewan create more difficulties? Yes, but it'll probably be around health transfers. I've been asking people what would happen if Ottawa added one more condition to healthcare transfers. As you know, what they do is they have 5 now. Provinces get Medicare money if they don't put on user fees, if benefits are portable, if there's public administration. I really believe that this would be difficult. On the other hand, everyone I've asked, would it be right to ask the provinces to start compiling more readily available healthcare data, to start contributing to these national data programs? I'm hearing from people I ask, yes, of course, it's common sense. So we could have a big argument coming between what Canadian citizens believe should happen, and that must vary from province to province, depending on how inflammatory the rhetoric gets from provincial governments, and what Ottawa is looking for in return for raising the money. I think it might have to increase its transfers. I think they now increase by 3% per year, the health transfer. It's going to have to increase it quite rapidly to try and cope with the demand.
Thanks, Mary. Jim, we have other questions lined up, but did you have a quick comment on, do you think the health transfer focus is fruitful? Do you think we shouldn't drop the discussion about the hydro issue, or what's your final thought on this one?
Well, I think the hydro issue is still in play with equalization, but by and large, equalization is working pretty well. I think Mary's hit something, though, on the Canada health transfer. I think that is really now the dominant issue. Everybody's got problems with the healthcare system. I don't think more federal money will necessarily solve everything, because you still have
you're right.
Innovation and resource issues and everything else to deal with. But I think the real focus now has to be more and more on the healthcare problems. And the feds have to be willing, I think, to make more of a move to help the provinces. And the provinces have to find ways of innovating as well and dealing with it. So I think that's where we're headed right now when it comes to fiscal federalism.
Yeah.
But thank you. I won't take any more of the time.
Thanks a million, Jim. Great to have you back on a Harris Center panel. I think Kathy does have other questions or comments lined up there.
Yeah, we've got a question there from Russell Williams. Is the political baggage about equalization the problem rather than the program itself? Aside from being constitutionally enshrined, is it possible to imagine a less politically charged way to achieve these transfers? For example, just larger per capita transfers over an equalizing mechanism?
There is actually, there are suggestions. One of the ones that makes the most sense, but I don't think it's going to happen, is to create a panel like Australia has. Australia has the Commonwealth Grants Commission, which was established, and initially the grants were, the formula was devised by one of the most eccentric, brilliant people I've ever read about, an Australian economist, mathematician called L.F. Giblin in 1933. And the Commonwealth Grants Commission has lasted. They distribute different revenues now. They take the money out of their equivalent of their GST and distribute it, but it's working. And the reason it works is because it's viewed as non-political. L.F. Giblin was revered. He was a friend of the Bloomsbury Group. He was a pal of John Maynard Keynes. He had done just about everything on the planet. He piloted huge vessels into Sydney Harbor. He was a lumberman and a gold prospector in northern Canada. He managed to make this work, and it's continued to work. To very esteemed academics, Daniel Bayland and Andre Lecour, have suggested that Canada set up something like that. A panel that's at arm's length from the finance department that is headed by people who are esteemed, who are viewed as non-political and certainly non-biased. I know there's no such thing, but they could be as much as possible away from that. I think that might work. Initially, of course, every province would be furious. They would be saying, oh, I object to this person from da-da because, but it could really work. A panel that cooperated, that examined the revenue sources, that was transparent, I think could eventually win over Canadians and depoliticize equalization. Now, Ottawa may not want to do that. If you're sitting in the finance department and you're juggling obscure sources of taxation and revenue, you may wish not to surrender that opportunity and therefore that control. Don't forget, from the start, equalization was Ottawa's unilateral decision, and it has maintained that control. Look at how they automatically renewed it in 2019 with really just announced that, which triggered Alberta in some ways, I believe. But yes, there should be other ways to do it. Could you raise the equalization pot per capita? You'd have to rejig the whole formula. It's based now on the fiscal capacity of each province and what is judged the national average fiscal capacity. That is, what would a pot of taxes raise per person? I think you'd have to start all over again, and God knows, then we'd kill ourselves. I'd go with a commission. And
Thanks, Mary. And I think we do have a couple more hands up. So, Kathy?
Yeah, we've got David Douglas has his hand up there. I think Mandy's going to turn on his mic.
Right on. David's another longtime collaborator of the Harris Center, based in Ontario, but deep Newfoundland roots. Go ahead, David.
hi.
I hope I require no apologies from Ontario. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Mary, for that presentation. This was very, very informative. I have a question about maybe the question of repopulating the table. It seems to be, in all instances, a federal provinces or federal government and states conversation. Have any federations thought about a third party, namely the private sector? Perhaps they're at the table or tables indirectly, but have Australia, have Germany, have other federally constituted states, have they looked at the question of engaging the private sector in the conversations, or as they seen as essentially free riders on the system? I'd be interested to know whether anybody has looked at that.
I wish I had. 2/3 of the world's governments are now, world countries are now federations. And all of them, all of the developed ones share. The only thing I can contribute to this very good question is that every now and then, Parliament has committees that look into equalization, and then they do call witnesses that do include corporate representatives who speak to the revenues that are needed in order to make provincial governments work. I believe, actually, but I have no idea if it'll happen, that the time has come for a royal commission into the whole structure of fiscal federalism. It is so entangled. I believe that, like the McDonald Commission all of those years ago, you could have some wonderful, innovative suggestions on how to change the equalization formula without setting all of the governments at each other's throats, let alone arousing the population with accurate and inaccurate allegations.
Mm.
That's a really good question.
David, any
Thank you.
follow up on that one?
No, thank you. Thanks, Mary, for the response. In part, I raised it in part just because of, we're in the times of governance. We're always talking about collaborative governance or good governance and so on and so on. And we're supposedly in a post-neoliberal era of change and readjustment. So it would seem timely initiative to at least examine the feasibility of this and the interests of the private sector. And I suppose you could extend that into civil society in general, actually, and say, well, what about the community-based or the so-called third sector? Should the third sector be at the table? Because everybody has an interest, but I suppose we are, in a way, paying the freight differentially.
Well,
Thank you.
trade unions and women's groups and a lot of other civil society groups were the ones who pushed for social programs in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. And there's no reason they could not have input again. Equalization seems to bring out some of the idealism that these groups have, and I think it'd be welcome.
Thanks, Mary. I saw a comment from Lev Tarasov that was along the lines of where I wanted to go, but I think, Kathy, you have another hand up or question?
Yeah, Dave already has his hand up, so we can give him the go ahead.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Okay. In your book, I noticed you say that the United States doesn't have an equalization program, and my question to you is do you think that they would have one? Would the pressure on them to have an equalization program be greater if they had a state-run healthcare system? Obviously, now they're moving towards a mandatory healthcare system, but privately funded. And I'm curious as to two questions, I guess. One is why has the U.S. chosen not to have an equalization program? And number two, do you think it has anything to do with how their healthcare is being financed?
Yes. Beland and LaCour, the two academics I mentioned earlier, economists, political scientists, looked at the United States in an essay. I believe it came out 10 years ago. And they had several different reasons for that. One, they said that there isn't the same ethic of sharing in the United States. There isn't the same tradition of sharing through public governments that obtains in Canada. Number two, and they viewed that as very important, that many Americans would view such a program as socialism, if not worse. Number two, they noted, which in retrospect makes everyone laugh, that since 1865, there hasn't been a territorial threat to the United States. And so therefore, there was no need to try and keep the states happy. Well, in the wake of January 6th, that is a bit interesting, but there was a third reason as well, and I'm sorry I can't recall, but it's a superb essay looking at equalization and the United States. Daniel Beland and Andre LaCour looking at it. As to healthcare, we all watched what Hillary Clinton went through when she tried to get an agreement. There's just not that same ethic of sharing. And also, I think people get used to certain healthcare systems, and that's why they're so difficult to change. People become accustomed to how the financing works. They also become, they're unaware of what's actually private provision within the healthcare system. And I think it's quite hard to go there and change things fundamentally. Change comes so slowly that often states end up with the system they had when they started bringing in public payments. I don't know how far people can go and change. An earlier questioner talked about innovation, and that is a key part of the system as well. But for the United States, that fundamental ethic doesn't seem capable of changing very much. I mean, the Republicans were talking about trying to dismantle elements of Obamacare only a few weeks ago. Any wisdom you have on this would be welcome.
Dave, a quick follow-up?
No, I'll leave it at that, I think. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to jump in quickly on the Lev Tarasov point because it fits with what I wanted to raise. And Mary, I don't know if you have thoughts on this. I think it relates a little bit to the U.S. example because in the U.S., as I think we all know, the states relative to the national government in the U.S. are not near as powerful as the provinces are relative to the national government in Canada. Local government is much stronger in the U.S. relative to local government in Canada. The OECD says Canada has the weakest local government of all its members. And a lot of my work over the years has looked at the Nordic countries, and they have large territories, dispersed population, very different history, but they have very strong local government. Of course, they're not federal, they're unitary. They have some degree of county in the middle. But local government, I know Norway best, collects income tax up to a certain percentage. And we know the big city mayors constantly go on about the lack of resources to achieve the mandates they have. But those of us who study rural know smaller municipalities also lack the resources they need, and they are creatures of the provinces under the Constitution. Any thoughts, Mary? Is this a complete dead end, or is that part of the puzzle going forward?
I just finished an essay for Massey College on cities and equalization, in which it was very hard to do. It hasn't been published yet. I believe UBC is bringing it out. I found it extremely difficult because you're right, other nations, other local governments in other nations do impose income taxes. They have a variety of so many other taxes. I tried playing with something that reshuffling the revenues that Ottawa already gives out through a potpourri of programs, trying to ensure that those revenues were put into a pot for the big cities, not the smaller ones. So you may perhaps take me on this, might give local governments more resources with less conditions. Now, many provinces will probably insist on passing that money through from Ottawa to the local governments. But you're right, they have to find better ways to raise revenues. I couldn't conceive of a way that they could impose income taxes. It's like healthcare systems. Ships change slowly. What do you think?
Well, I think you're right. We do have path dependency in these cases. I would take you on to suggest it shouldn't just be big cities. It's local government. And we do know, just as the provinces, as Confederation evolved, have many more responsibilities compared to what they had in 1867, the same applies to the local sub-province and our territories, other than PEI and maybe New Brunswick, Nova Scotia a bit. All the other provinces' territories are so massive, and geography matters.
Yes.
Kathy, we may have time for one last quick question. Anything there?
We have exhausted all of the questions, which I think just speaks to the depth and the amazing conversation we've had today. So thanks to everyone for the great questions.
Mary, any last thoughts from you?
I just wanted to add one thing. I'm half Newfoundlander. My mother came from Codroy. I have cousins in many parts of Newfoundland, but especially in the Codroy Valley and in Corner Brook. And a lot of them went to Alberta, especially after the cod dried up. This has been a huge honor for me to be here. It matters. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mary. And you can tell by the engagement and the quality of the engagement that it's an issue that matters a lot to us. And we at the Harris Center are delighted to partner with our Department of Political Science to enable you to present on your book. And as we mentioned at the beginning, for some of the people who entered questions, we'll do a draw and follow up with them with the 3 copies you were good enough to provide us with. And it's exactly the kind of discussion we love to have with the Harris Center. I want to thank you and everybody who joined us today. You can find Mary's book on her website, www.maryjanigan.ca, and you will be able to access the recording of this session on the Harris Center website, www.mun.ca/Harris Center. Thanks to the Department of Political Science for collaborating on today's event. Thanks to Kathy, Mandy, and Stephanie at the Harris Center, the amazing team we have for making this all come together. And stay tuned for more events from us in the future. In fact, on November 29, we'll be launching our vital signs document, which is focused on Forecast NL, climate, economy, and society in Newfoundland and Labrador. And watch your emails for the winner of one of Mary's books. And thank you, Mary. It's been a real pleasure and great to work with you. And everybody have a great day and